everybody, I'm Jeff Bower.
And I'm Joey Marino. Welcome back to Actor Chats.
This week we have the first part of our chat with Stephen Book.
Stephen Book is a famous world-renowned acting teacher whose students include William Hurt, Rita Moreno, Val Kilmer, the lovely Maura Tierney, George Carlin, David Boreanaz, Sanaa Lathan, and many others just as famous. He taught a whole generation of our best actors, Jeff.
His books, Book on Acting, Improvisation Technique for the Professional Actor in Film, Theater, and Television, and The Actor Takes a Meeting are available on Amazon.com. You can also find more information about classes on his website, www.stephenbook.com, and that's Stephen with a PH.
This episode, Stephen talks about how he became a teacher, his time at USC and Juilliard, and working with Viola Spolin.
So here is Actor Chats with Stephen Book.
Okay, welcome to Actor Chats. We're back, glad to be back, and really glad to be in the home of Stephen Book, in my opinion, one of the greatest acting teachers. We're really happy to be in his home. Hey, Stephen.
Hello. Nice to have you here.
So usually when we start Actor Chats, the first question we always ask is, what drew you to the arts? Was there one specific moment in your life where you were drawn to this, or kind of like an origin story? What do you think there's, or was it just a culmination of a lot of things that made you want to?
In high school, I was a performer. I was in the high school plays. Before high school, I was a performer. I was a magician. At 12 years old, I was a magician. And then in high school, I would try out for the plays and be in the plays. And I thought I was pretty good. And that was going to be the end of it. Until I had a guidance counselor. We didn't have any money for college. And it was a big drama in my family, what we're going to do. My parents wanted me to go to college. I was not a great student. So I had a guidance counselor who turned me on to a college in Long Island. I grew up in Westchester County, in Yonkers. And this college, it was called Adelphi, they offered one scholarship a year, full tuition, room and board, everything, for a drama major who would be an actor. You had to audition for this scholarship. And I had nothing to lose, and I won it. So all of a sudden, I had to be a drama major, I had to be in the plays. I became a drama major. Until that point, I had just never entertained thoughts about being a professional actor.
What age is this?
Senior year in high school is when I won the scholarship.
Wow.
So I went off to Adelphi as a drama major, thinking I'm now, okay, when I graduate college, I'll be an actor. And it was exciting and I liked it. I just hadn't considered it until I won the scholarship.
Do you remember your audition piece?
Yeah. I did Waiting for Lefty, Clifford Odets,
Yes.
and Peter Ustinov's Romanoff and Juliet for my comedy piece.
Wow.
So I went off to Adelphi, and I wasn't happy there with the college. It just wasn't exciting. It didn't fulfill all the thoughts I had anticipating college from my parents, the best years of your life, that whole thing. And I'm trying to make this a shorter story. I ended up transferring junior year to the Sarah Lawrence College. And I was also the only undergraduate man at Sarah Lawrence. And I'm leaving out that whole part of the story.
No worries.
And at Sarah Lawrence, that's where I fell in love with education for the first time in my life.
How did that shift happen? Like all of a sudden you didn't think you were a good student and then you had a shift?
The quality of the school,
Ah.
the quality of the teachers, the structure of the education. It was the first time in my life I found education exciting.
Oh.
And everything changed at Sarah Lawrence. The most important change was they had a visiting professor that year, Viola Spolin.
No way.
and she and I hit it off big time.
Really?
I became, well, if you've ever taken like comedy improv classes,
Jeff does. Jeff
Okay.
does that.
well, you'll know that when people take improv classes for the first time, they fall in love with it
Mhm.
across the board.
Right.
So I fell in love with it, plus it was Viola Spolin. Now this is before anybody ever heard of Viola Spolin. Her book had only been out a couple of years, and that's how hip Sarah Lawrence was.
She is like
Yeah.
the high priestess.
Viola Spolin, she invented what we all know today as improvisation.
Yes.
I mean, improv goes all the way back to the Commedia, centuries ago. But as what we all think of today as improvisation, which is usually improvisational comedy, most of the time it's not even really improvised. But the material was discovered in improv sessions. I'm
Yes.
talking about groups like the Groundlings
Right.
and the Upright Citizens Brigade and Second
Right.
City and all of that. So Viola invented the form, the exercises that anybody who's ever taken an improv class has done her exercises. And everything, if you went into the drama bookshop or Samuel French in the 60s, there was no shelf called improv.
Really?
Right.
Yeah.
In the acting section, there would be one book, Improvisation for the Theater, Viola Spolin. And she started it all. And now if you go into either store, there are shelves and shelves of books on improv. But she was the first, and her son is Paul Sills, and they created the Second City. So anyway, so that's who Viola Spolin is, right? And her work is used way beyond improv theater. It's used in education, it's used in psychology, it's used in special education. That's a whole other subject.
When you first met her, do you remember that moment when you first met and you first had a chat and how that went down?
No, I remember the class.
Okay.
I mean, being the only boy in the school
Oh.
gave me an advantage in many ways, but in terms of Viola, she wanted me to be in all of her sections. She taught a course, but she was visiting for one semester or 1 year, and so they wanted, a lot of students wanted to take this class, and so they divided it up into sections. Section 1 met on Mondays at 2, Section 2 met on Tuesdays at 4, whatever. And I was the only student who was encouraged to be in each section, because I was the only guy.
Right.
Fantastic.
Viola wanted. So I took all these sections and I got turned on, the way anybody who takes an improv course gets turned on. I got turned on really big, really, really big. And that led me to seek her out on a higher plane rather than just one of the students in the classes. And we really hit it off.
Yes.
And I became her, her assistant.
Okay.
So, and that led to everything that's happened since then. The other thing that happened at Sarah Lawrence was I went in as an actor coming out of the Adelphi experience, and at Sarah Lawrence, another teacher asked me to, in his acting class, asked me to direct a scene for class. He assigned 2 girls to be in the scene, and he said, "Stephen, why don't you direct it?" So I directed the scene, and that was fun, and I liked it. It was the first directing I'd ever done, but it came out really good, and the teacher then said, after we did the scene in class, "This is really good. Why don't we do the whole show? Let's do the whole play."
Yes.
And that turned out to be the American premiere of The Killing of Sister George by Frank Marcus, which a year and a half later opened on Broadway. And so I directed the whole play. That's part of why Sarah Lawrence was so good, that they could do that they could say, "Well, this seems great, let's do the whole show." And all of a sudden we're doing a full
It's
production.
happening, yeah.
It's a small, high-class school. So during that, I realized I'd much rather be a director than an actor. I felt I had as much potential talent in directing as I had in acting.
Right.
And in directing, you get to play all the parts. So that's what happened at Sarah Lawrence. I became a director and then and started this relationship with Viola. So I graduate Sarah Lawrence and I go to Stanford to get an MFA in directing. Now at the time, no longer so, Stanford had a program similar to Yale's, where the MFA program was attached to a full resident equity company. That Yale and Stanford were the only two schools in America that did that. Yale continues to do that to this day, and Stanford stopped years ago. So at Stanford, I get to Stanford, and in the first week, the MFA students, the second and third year MFA students, call a meeting of all the MFA students to welcome the first year MFA students. And they tell us about a program that they have, that they invented, called the Midnight Mafia. What was the Midnight Mafia?
I don't know, I'm Italian, so I like this.
Prior to my arrival, my year's arrival, the MFA students had found out that it was a big part of their program, was to be in the Stanford Repertory Theater, the equity company's plays. But there was an equity company there, so they were just getting small parts, walk-ons, spear carriers, and they weren't happy with that. Now, sure, the department gave them a couple of MFA productions a year for them, but that wasn't enough for them. So, and Stanford's a quality school too, so what did Stanford do? Stanford gave the MFA students their own black box theater to do whatever they wanted with, and so the Master Fine Arts in Acting, Mafia.
Nice.
And they had no time to do anything because on the weekends they were in the Stanford Repertory Theater productions. So what they did, and they had no time to rehearse, so they would throw together one-act plays or put together improv, sketches and whatnot, and they would do them at midnight after the Stanford rep shows in their black box theater. And that was the Midnight Mafia. So we go to this meeting where they're telling us about all of this and how we're expected to be a part of it. We're the first year students. And does anybody have any preferences? Anybody want to be in the improv group? You could, and I don't, this is the key moment. I don't know where it came from, but I raised my hand and I said, look, I really have some experience. I just spent some serious time with Viola Spolin. I'll take over the improv section and we'll perform every Saturday night, and I'll just ask one thing, because everyone in the group was happy that somebody volunteered
to do
take
the work.
responsibility.
Yes, exactly.
I said, all I ask is that you sign up to be in the group and you come to sessions that I will lead. Think of it as classes, think of it as rehearsals, whatever you want, but you've got to come 3 times a week for an hour, hour and a half, I don't remember what it was.
Right.
And if you agree to that, then you're in the group and I'm taking responsibility.
Wow.
And so about 10 of them said yes, and that led to me essentially teaching my first classes.
That is great.
And I did that, and I found out I was good at that. And so I got into it, and I liked it. And I was also a performer in the group, but I was the director, teacher. And the department got behind me. They were happy that a student had emerged to do this, and that the fellow students were happy with this.
Yeah.
Instead of bitching about that teacher they hate. So they made it official, and they made me a TA. And in addition to that, they asked me to teach undergraduate acting classes.
That's incredible.
Nice.
It had nothing to do with the mafia.
Right.
And so I started teaching.
I gave them all for your kind of
And I went with that. And then one of my professors, my directing professor, who I had a great relationship with, he saw something in me and he invited me to join the faculty of a summer school that he taught at, called the Breadloaf School of English.
That's right.
In Vermont, where the students are all English and theater teachers, high school, college level. They go there in the summers and get an advanced degree, a doctorate, I don't remember what it is. And so I went with him, and now I'm really teaching, because my students are all older than me. They're all already theater teachers, and my colleagues were phenomenal, high-end English professors. William Arrowsmith, Eric Siegel, the chairperson of Yale, Harvard, Princeton, major professors. And so I learned a lot from them, just being around them and auditing their classes. And so I taught there for 8 summers. And I graduated Stanford now, and I still had no intention on being a teacher. I was very focused on, I'm going to New York, and I'm going to be the next Mike Nichols. I wanted to be a Broadway director.
My goodness.
You know, because I was good at it. And I read all my reviews, and they were all rave. I was convinced that's what it was going to be.
Right.
Exactly.
And I was going to be very happy. So I go to New York, and at this point now I'm living with a woman who I ultimately married and divorced. So we go to New York to begin my directing career. My then wife is starting an MFA program in film directing at NYU. But we have to make a living. So what am I going to do? After a couple of really straight day jobs, you know, I was personnel
They're awful.
at Macy's.
Yeah.
I did telephone soliciting, you know. I realized, what the hell am I doing this for? I should teach, which I actually like doing, and it's related to directing. And so I started teaching in New York, and I got a job first at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts, and then I got a job at the Circle in the Square Theater School. Now this is all going on while I'm simultaneously pursuing a New York theater directing career, which in the first year means I direct 4 off-Broadway shows. And then my 3rd year in New York, my 2nd year, Juilliard hires me.
Oh.
So now I'm the improv teacher at Juilliard.
Oh, you were a young man.
That was
To say
very
the least.
Yeah, I was older than these students. But,
Right.
And then at another job, I was a visiting professor at Brown University. And so far, none of these jobs are keeping me from pursuing my directing career. The 2nd year I'm there, I'm doing more off-Broadway, and I get my first off-Broadway show, and I get my first regional theater show. So everything's going fine. My directing career is moving along very nicely, getting promoted each year, but my teaching career is through the roof.
Oh.
I'm teaching at the top school in the country.
Yeah.
So after about a few years of this, meanwhile I stay in touch with Viola Spolin,
Okay.
especially when we're back at Stanford. And she had, during those years, she's in LA, and I'm at Stanford, but we had developed a very strong relationship, and I would be talking to her or writing to her about what I'm doing with the Mafia at Stanford.
Yes.
Like, I'm running an improv group. Why? You know, and what are you doing? And we consult. And that led to, and so between the years of Sarah Lawrence and Stanford, Viola had made me her official assistant. And when she would go on the road to do major workshops for the American Theater Association or whoever, I would go as her assistant. And then starting while I was at Stanford, and definitely by the time we were in New York, she would get gigs where she would just send me instead of her. She'd say, you know, I'm too old, I don't do this anymore, but I've got a young man who I give the seal of approval to, and we're very close. And so I was doing that during the Stanford, New York years. And then she calls me and says, The National Education Laboratory has offered Viola a deal. They will finance an aesthetic education learning center based on her work. They'll call it the Spolin Theater Games Center. Viola's always attached to the words theater games. She invented theater games. And she can do whatever she wants there. Now they're interested because by now the book has been out about 10 years and people are picking up on it all around the world. Piaget, the eminent French psychologist, early childhood education, wrote a chapter about the importance of Viola's work in childhood education. And they're discovering that theater games are having a profound effect on children learning in elementary school. Not theater,
Right. Yes.
just learning.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
And Viola, by now, is kind of fed up with actors.
Really?
Yeah, she used
It
to.
happens, Stephen.
Yeah.
Can't imagine why.
I don't know.
But the reason she always gave was actors eat and run.
What
I
did
like
she
that.
want?
I like that.
What she meant by that was they didn't give back. They came, they got the training, everything was terrific, and then she never saw them again.
And they rape and pillage you
Yeah.
often.
So she was fed up with them, and she was very excited about how all these extra theatrical areas were benefiting from her work, from
Yeah.
initially the book, Improvisation for the Theater. So the National Education Laboratory in the Midwest in St. Louis says, we'll put up the money and we'll create a center around you, and you've got to be the guru and really develop your work now for these other areas. And at this point, she's in her 60s, and she says, well, I'm too old to start.
A program. Yeah.
A center.
Yeah. Holy.
Find the building, put it together, the whole 9 yards. But there's this man in New York who I'm very close to. If we can get him to do it, I'll be his partner, and I'll be the guru. We'll walk around the hallways and and everything. So I get this invitation, and I think, wow, chance to go back to work with Viola. And at this point, it was very clear to me that she's going to become historically very important in the theater and education. And I saw it as a major opportunity.
Yes.
Plus, my marriage was starting to fall apart. And
I mean, laugh. That's awful.
My then wife was from LA. Her family lived in LA. So I thought, well, what the hell? Maybe a change. She'll have her family around her, and maybe a change will be good for the marriage.
Yeah.
So I take the gig. So we come out here, and I don't want to give up Juilliard.
Mm.
So I keep Juilliard, and I become bicoastal.
Oh wow.
Wow. You were probably one of the first.
I doubt it. So for 3 years, I created the Theater Game Center with Vi, and it was very exciting. We did some wonderful things. We rewrote the curriculum for LA Unified School System for their special education classes using
No
theater
way.
games.
Wow.
We had programs for what were then called wards of the court,
Wards of the court.
juvenile delinquents.
Right.
Okay.
We had programs for blind children. We were getting into psychology. We trained school teachers in how to use theater games in the classroom, regardless of the curriculum. And to keep me happy, Viola agreed to have one class of actors who would meet once a week. And she didn't want them, but she only did it because I wanted them, because I was dropping out of directing. And frankly, I didn't have the interest that she had in theater games in classrooms, theater games and juvenile delinquents, but I was willing to be the administrator, and it turned out the head teacher. So she let me have an acting class.
Yes.
I insisted on it. And
Would that be considered group one? Because I know you put these groups together.
No, that was the Spolin Theater Game Center.
Okay, that was
the
your
first acting class at
acting
the
class
Spolin
of the
Theater Game
Spolin
Center.
Theater Game Center.
And so for 3 years, I was going back and forth to Juilliard. And though we made it easy on me, I'd go back like in 6-week chunks, and then come back out here. And I essentially was teaching pretty much 90% of all the courses. And Viola would sit in the room. Even if the course was labeled Taught by Viola Spolin, I taught it, but Viola sat in the room, and we'd frequently collaborate. And I'd go, she'd call me over, and she'd go, why don't you try this, try that, I don't think this is working, let's change that rule. So those 3 years were absolutely phenomenal in terms of me getting a really saturated dose of Viola. My first saturated dose of her, I was a complete novitiate. I didn't know anything. But by the time this happened, I'd already been teaching at Juilliard and whatnot, so I kind of knew something now. And I was the administrator. I had to go to Sacramento and Washington for grants and all that kind of stuff. I burned out after 3 years.
Really?
And
what, just too much teaching?
No, Viola. Viola was a genius, most important person in my life, but difficult to work with. Not necessarily as a student or as a co-teacher, but as an administrator. She'd always change her mind at the last minute about this or that, or she'd be worried about someone's teaching her work in Syracuse, New York, and they're not giving her the proper credit. This kind of stuff. She was very difficult. She's famous for that among people who've ever dealt with her. So I just burned out.
Yeah.
And simultaneously with that, my first boss at Juilliard was John Houseman. He's the one who brought me in there. And he left Juilliard, turned it over to Alan Schneider, my second boss at Juilliard. And John Houseman wanted to stay full-time on the West Coast. He had a house out in Malibu. And so he took a job. USC hired him to turn the USC Theater School into a Juilliard of the West. That was their goal.
My goodness.
So he came out here. He knew I was here. So I was his first hire for the new USC Theater School. And because I was working at the Theater Game Center when he did this, he gave me a fantastic one-day-a-week professorship. So I would go in on Fridays, and I'd teach a 3-hour class in the morning for the undergraduates in the BFA program, and a 3-hour class in the afternoon for the MFA program.
How are you feeling now about it all? About not directing as much, but really committed to the teaching?
Well, I learned something. I was so involved in working so many hours that I didn't really miss the directing that much. And somewhere in here, I'm not sure if it happened while it was still at the Theater Game Center or right after when I left them. And when I left them, I now had, other than going back and forth to Juilliard for another couple of years, I only had a one-day-a-week commitment out here. So I had time. But somewhere in this period, I said, okay, it's time to go back to directing. And that's when I had the rude awakening of LA theater. And I realized that the only place I could direct would be small theater. I mean, I started making rounds immediately, which I knew how to do from New York, but the rounds were limited to the Mark Taper Forum, and the Mark Taper Forum.
Geez, you tried the Mark
And the Mark Taper
Yes.
There was really just one theater at that time in LA. There were big theaters, the Amundsen and the Pantages, but they weren't hiring directors. They put these big packages together in New York, the road shows and whatever. And so I started a relationship with the Taper, but I saw that this was going to take forever to develop, which is understandable. I mean, there was theaters in New York where I started those kinds of relationships, not expecting anything to happen for 10 years. So I started directing little theater in LA, at the old LA Actors Theater, which became the LA Theater Center. And I realized that I was going backwards.
Yeah.
I was now directing what would be the equivalent of off-Broadway.
Yes.
But when I left New York, I was already directing off-Broadway and regional theaters. So I was going backwards. Okay, that's all right, I'll do that.
Yeah.
But I didn't like it.
No.
I didn't like the experience. I had to look over my shoulder to make sure the producer didn't inadvertently sabotage the show. I had to deal with actors who had a very different attitude about rehearsals than the New York actors,
Really?
even at the off-Broadway level. They wouldn't come to rehearsals because they had a commercial audition.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, I'm here so many years, I understand this, but it was just different from New York. I just didn't have a good experience. The shows were hits and everything, and then I'd have to look around on the same level for another waiver show. And I was fulfilling my need to direct because Houseman gave me a deal where I would direct one play a year for
Okay.
USC.
Nice. With the MFAs or the BFAs or
Whatever I wanted.
whatever you wanted,
It
even
turned out,
better.
it turned out I did the MFAs.
Nice.
Now, I stayed at USC for 14 years, directing MFA shows, BFA shows. So I stopped pursuing directing as a career and just did it as a part of my gig at USC.
Yeah.
But now I've got all this free time. So I gave up Juilliard.
Okay.
The flying back and forth was just
Too much.
I didn't need it. But this was the point where I could have decided to move back to New York. But at this point, I'm into the weather.
Yes.
I'm into my nice gig at USC. I'm enjoying the freedom of not having to be responsible for the Spolin Theater Game Center.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of stay, but I'm always lying to myself that, well, you can go back to New York next year.
So that concludes the first part of our chat with Stephen Book.
So Stephen found out what he really wanted was not to direct.
Right? Be sure to tune in next segment when Stephen Book talks about normal acting teaching or reactive teaching versus his improvisation technique.
This has been Actor Chats with Stephen Book.